first lecture was mostly about Russian immigration to the United States specifically. Today we will be talking mostly about things that happened outside of the United States with the Russian diaspora in the 20th century. We're talking about the Soviet-era immigration between 1917 and 1991. This is really our focus. Wherever there is a small digression from this period somewhere else, I will point this out, but mostly we are talking about this 20th century Soviet-era immigration. And several months ago, because I was doing a different but sort of related project for myself, I tried to map the cities, the main centers of the 20th century Russian immigration. And when I tried to do that, and that's an ongoing project, it's really a work in progress, so there are like some red dots that are not on the map but should be on the map, so it's incomplete at this point, but that's how it looks. Even from here you can see how many places did Russian communities reach in the 20th century, and like these dots, they basically represent either some prominent figures or places where books were published, and the size of the dot sort of roughly corresponds to the number of these events. For example, you can see that Paris is much bigger than many other places here, for example, San Francisco is also an important center for the 20th century immigration. So, to be fair, this does not exactly depict the Russian diaspora in general, because my personal research has to do with specifically like Russian esoteric communities, people doing things like astrology, Freemasonry, yoga and stuff. So these are like the centers of Russian esoteric diaspora, but realistically they are representative of places where there were like big Russian communities more broadly. It stands to reason that if you have a lot of like Russians generally speaking, then some of them also would create communities with special interests. But if you look at this map like this, it kind of does not have this temporal dimension to it. It is like this 20th century. But actually, Russian communities did not spread in all of these places like in the same decade. The immigration happened sort of step by step over a long period of time. And there are several main waves of Russian immigration, and that is what I will start with tonight. So if we look at how the immigration started, particularly now after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, it basically started in two directions from the Russian Empire, or the Soviet Union when it emerged. And these directions were obvious, like closest regions to the Russian Empire were, well, Europe and China. So if you're talking about the 1920s, we will see that a lot of Russian immigrants basically headed to these countries. Many of them already had some networks there, either they had studied in Europe before that, or spent some time there, or worked in China, or something like this. And people from European part of Russia, of course, would mostly head to Europe, whereas people from eastern parts of Russia, from the regions that are closer to China, would, of course, oftentimes end up in China, particularly in places like Harbin over there and Shanghai, which were two of the biggest centers of the Russian diaspora in that country at the time. And one thing that you should understand about this wave of Russian immigration is that because the revolution and then the civil war happened in Russia, and because the Soviet government was suspicious and to some extent even hostile towards the immigrants, many of them ended up being outside of Russia, outside of the Soviet Union, without any documentation. So one of the problems that they had to solve was how to get some paperwork, identification, etc., etc. And it was in the 1920s when the system emerged in response to that. The Nansen passport, an international document that was issued at that time in the 20s and the 30s by the League of Nations, which was an international organization, kind of like predecessor of the United Nations. And basically this international body took upon itself to issue identification for refugees, including Russian refugees leaving the country during and after the Civil War. So at this period of time, there were huge Russian communities in places like Belgrade over there, Paris, as well as Harbin, which had historically strong ties to Russia. Russian immigrants heading there were like in huge numbers, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people. They basically built initially the whole infrastructure for themselves, like Russian language schools, universities, etc., which survived for 20 years or so, basically before World War II. And the system started to fall apart during World War II, and especially after World War II, with first of all, the collapse of the League of Nations, and the nonsense system, then with sort of like the change of policies of European governments that realized that the Bolsheviks are there to stay and that it doesn't make sense to sponsor all of these Russian organizations in Europe, because initially they had done this hoping that the Bolshevik government will eventually fall apart, etc. So none of this happened. So basically then because of the fall of the League of Nations, now the nonsense system also collapsed, and that meant for many people that they were left without any proper paperwork. And in Eastern Europe and in China, we have the rise of communism, so the people who fled from communism to these countries naturally found themselves once again in the situation that they were looking where to move to escape communism. Which, well, not necessarily to escape communism, to be honest. So here's the thing. Another thing that happened at the time was that during World War II, the Russian immigrant community, Russian diaspora, sort of split into two. Some rooted for Germany in the sense that they rooted for the fall of the communist government. They hoped that the war will lead to the fall of Stalin and to the fall of the communist system and so on. So this was one part of the diaspora. The other part of the diaspora was rooting for the Soviet Union on the grounds that even if they were not necessarily happy with the communist authorities, they sort of think that these authorities started to change during World War II. Indeed, the Soviet government became sort of more liberal towards religion, for example, because to incorporate it in the war effort, sort of build better relationships with Western countries, which were allies during World War II. So there was a hope that maybe the Soviet system will transform. Also, some people in the diaspora collaborated with the authorities, with the Soviet authorities during World War II, sort of trying to attract public attention to the cause, to support the Soviet Union during World War II, and so on. So what happened after World War II is that we see basically two processes happening at the same time. Some people deciding to repatriate to the Soviet Union for a variety of reasons. Some people decided to look for other places to live. And most commonly, this place would be South America. Why South America? Well, because South America had an open policies with regards to relatively open policies with regard to immigration at the time. That's why during the late 40s and especially during the 50s, we see the rise, for example, of publications in Russian appearing in countries like Argentina, in countries like Paraguay, and so on. Periodicals, books, etc. So these regions had a fairly thriving Russian diasporic community. The next transformation with the Russian diaspora happened starting approximately the middle of the 1950s. During this time, what changed is that the United States started to change its policy towards immigration, particularly from socialist countries. And the new doctrine that more or less started to shape in the mid-1950s, probably from Refugee Relief Act of the 1953. So the new policy was basically to treat people from socialist countries as refugees. Not just as immigrants, but as refugees who should be provided like refugee status and protection in the United States. That was what Refugee Relief Act was about. It was specifically aiming at people from socialist countries coming to the United States. And in the next 3 decades, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, the United States more or less consistently tried to follow this policy, basically opening its borders to accept people leaving the Soviet Union and to a lesser extent other socialist countries. In 1974, the fairly well-known Jackson-Vanik Amendment was introduced that specifically threatened, quote-unquote, countries with non-market economy who limit ability of their citizens to leave that countries, and like countries with non-market economy in this case is like in the vast majority of cases is the Soviet Union. So basically the problem it tried to solve was like this: even if the United States sort of opened itself to people leaving the Soviet Union did not necessarily allow its citizens to leave the country. You needed like exit visas, and those were not necessarily granted. But through negotiations and this kind of like thinking this problem over, eventually like the Soviet authorities also decided that it might be actually like more productive to keep out dissidents rather than, for example, sending them to prisons or something like this. So by the 1970s, we have this like next wave or much stronger stream of people moving to the United States, both from the Soviet Union directly and to a lesser extent from other countries, including those Latin American countries. So this is like the big picture of the history of Russian immigration during the 20th century, its main waves. And now we will move from this bird's eye view towards some very specific case studies. And I will start with 2 stories of 2 people who left the Russian Empire after the 1917 revolution for China. And what happened to them after that? Because these 2 people, they represent these 2 movements. Because one of them decided to return to the Soviet Union, and the other ended up in Brazil. So we will look through their biographies, and we will look through their books to some extent. In one case more so than in the other. Both of the books are there. These are actually like right there at the wall. One of them is called The Apocalypse of Gender. It was published in 2 editions. First, I believe, in the late 1920s, and the second edition in 1937 in China. The first one was published in Shanghai, the second one in Harbin. 2, as I have already said, main centers of the immigration at the time. So who was its author? He's not a particularly well-known figure, but he's not a particularly well-known figure nowadays, but he was kind of a big name in this Chinese like Russian communities in China in the 1920s and the 1930s. He was a poet, a philosopher. If we talk about his biography a little bit, he was actually a son of a Russian diplomat. The diplomat was stationed in Shanghai. Grasset himself was born actually not in China, in Japan, while his father was in one of these diplomatic missions. So basically, Grasset grew up in China, and his family, really after the 1917 revolution, you can see Grasset was like 11-ish years old at the time, but his family basically decided to stay in China. His father was, again, high-ranked diplomat, so they did not have like problems with money or anything like that. They stayed in China after the revolution, and basically that's where Grasset grew up and was educated. In the 1920s and the early 30s, he even spent some time in Europe, studying in Paris and in Berlin. In Paris, he became acquainted with Nikolai Berdyaev, and those remained in touch for a very long time. Nikolai Berdyaev, for those who don't know, is a very famous Russian philosopher who was also in immigration at the time in Paris, teaching there. So Grasset became friends with this famous Russian philosopher, and they had correspondence that spanned several decades. During World War II, Grasset was one of those who sympathized with the Soviet Union. Realistically, I should say that generally speaking, Grasset's view of the Soviet Union was rather critical, especially if you look, and we will look at the Apocalypse of Gender. It's actually kind of anti-Soviet book, or at least very critical of the Soviet Union. Though, to be fair, not just of the Soviet Union, but of the rest of the world as well. Now, during World War II, and maybe partially under the influence of Berdyaev, who was sort of moving at the time towards being more like open-minded and more sympathetic towards the Soviet Union, Grasset also shifted his views. He collaborated with Soviet diplomats at the time, and after the end of the war, he decided to repatriate. I guess it's not really repatriate in his case. He's never properly living in Russia before the revolution. Being born in Japan, growing up in China, and spending time in Europe. He decided to go to the Soviet Union. So in 1948, he returns to the Soviet Union, realizes that it's nothing what he imagined, faced all the censorship, bureaucracy, that kind of stuff. So he starts to try to leave the Soviet Union by writing to all sorts of authorities, including Joseph Stalin personally, asking for permission to leave the country. And of course, it all ended up at the table of some nice KGB officer who thought, okay, this guy is clearly a spy. Which is why a year after his return to the Soviet Union, he was basically arrested, sent to prison, and died somewhere around the 1950s. We don't even know which year exactly he died. Portable lesson: if you live in an authoritarian country, at least do not attract the attention of authorities, and particularly do not write to Joseph Stalin. That's not that smart. Well, so that's the biography. Now the book. The Apocalypse of Gender, is fascinating. I mean, I have never heard about Grasset before starting to work with this collection. But I was really mesmerized by this book because it's weird. It's super weird, super not what you expect. It is a book of religious philosophy. Grasset also had some books of poetry too, but this one is non-fiction. It is a book of religious philosophy of sorts. And you can see this very diverse, very eclectic background of the Russian diaspora in China, in which Grasset's views were shaped, as well as a lot of influences from different Russian philosophers, including Berdyaev, but also many others. So what this book is even about, what does it mean, the Apocalypse of Gender? Well, to be fair, basically the book is what it says. It is sort of a very weird commentary to the book of Revelation, the biblical book of Revelation. And so it is the apocalypse. It is about the apocalypse. And so if we take the book of Revelation, and we take a look at one specific passage from the book of Revelation, it's a fairly well-known passage. I saw a woman seated upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns, so on and so forth. It's a famous, often illustrated passage from the book of Revelation. But put yourself in the position of Grasset. This, late 1920s, you have heard about this revolution, had just happened in Russia, the rise of communism, world revolution, etc., etc. So, put yourself in the position of Grasset. How would you interpret the red, scarlet beast of the apocalypse?
Bolsheviks.
Yeah, it's of course. Of course, it's like, these Scooby-Doo cartoons, if you have seen them, like you take a mask from a guy and it's like under it, of course, it's like Bolshevism. Sure. Of course it is, because what else could it be? It is kind of obvious. So where is the gender coming from? Well, it's because really, I think that the two topics that Vori Grasset in the book is, well, first of all, the rise of communism, and then the sort of the movement for whatever, sexual liberation that was also big at the time, including in communist countries where the ideas about sexual liberation were popular in the 1920s, really, and they went hand by hand with this more general program of the social change that the communist movement emphasized. So his idea is basically that we are living in apocalyptic times. He did not go as far as to actually comment on specific passages of the Bible, although I think it's really a missed opportunity, especially if you think about it, I should have written this book instead of Grasset. See, for example, 10 horns, 7 heads. Isn't it 1917? Perfect. But he missed these opportunities, unfortunately. Unfortunately, we should write it instead of him. But anyhow, he does not go as far as to dive into commenting on specific passages of the Bible, but instead sort of gives this bigger picture of the modern 20th century world, saying that obviously all the signs are here, the events described in the book of Revelation are here, we are observing them, they manifest in the rise of communism and the revolution, but also in capitalist countries, in all of this materialism, etc., etc. And basically he says, okay, so what do we do? We live in the apocalyptic times. The Antichrist is somewhere very nearby, maybe is already active in the world, manifests through these political, economic movements, through new attitudes to sexuality. And the topic of sexuality was just big at the beginning of the 20th century. The society had been changing. The society was sort of transforming. The social roles of women have been changing. The attitudes to family, to sexuality have been changing. The time of Sigmund Freud is the time of the interest to this topic. In Russian philosophy, it was all over the place. So it makes sense that he's kind of also commenting on this topic. And his solution is also related to the topic of gender and sexuality, because his solution is really that the way for Christians to be saved during the apocalyptic times is to transcend the idea of gender, to sort of become this genderless angelic beings. And he actually literally takes it very, very literally. He thinks that through certain spiritual practice, the matter itself will be transformed, the structure of atoms will change, and we will transform into this different beings. More practically speaking, what he argues for is, so first of all, he's critical of sexuality and traditional, quote-unquote, traditional family, in the sense that he's critical of childbirth, for example, but he's for romantic love, and sort of his ideal is marriage without sex and without children, which was kind of big thing in the beginning of the 20th century in artistic circles. I can, out of the top of my head, name at least several cases of relatively famous figures who indeed did precisely that, including in Russian philosophy. After all, it is the time right after Vladimir Solovyov, who famously said, "I have never conceived anyone nor killed anyone," and thought about it as his two main achievements. Do not give birth to anybody and do not kill anybody. And that kind of mood was there in Russian philosophical tradition, Solovyov being this big name and of course omnipresent influence at the time. But also if you think about it, you can, if indeed you believe that we are living in apocalyptic time, you can probably find relevant passages in the Bible itself to support this notion. So despite being extremely weird, it's not that far-fetched from the point of view of like biblical commentary. There are these famous passages in the New Testament. For example, in Galatians, there is this famous phrase, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all in one in Christ Jesus. And there is in Gospel of Matthew, of course, the description of the time after the resurrection of the dead, where basically Jesus himself says, in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. That is to say, do not have families, do not give birth to children, etc., etc. So you can see where he is kind of coming from. But also, and probably for the most part, he is coming from the existing tradition of Russian philosophical thought, although I should confess that not many authors of the time went as far as to literally claim that each atom of matter will transform because of it into some kind of like totally new matter and totally new like transformed resurrected world. Now, what's important to say is that this really is a part of his larger like ethical and philosophical framework. Because realistically, what he argues for is that the line between like Christ and Antichrist is the line of being trapped in the matter or not being trapped in the matter. Antichrist really simply wants to trap people in material world. And basically, in this passage, what Grasset says is really very simple. He says, how do you differentiate Christ from Antichrist? It's really simple. Like, Antichrist is almost like Christ. That's almost everything the same, but it's always like just a material copy of what Christ could do. Say, for example, Christian saints ascended to heaven, but Antichrist will teach people how to like levitate through knowledge, fly through willpower, and so on. But it's like purely material flight, no ascension. Or Christ basically teach you how to live in this like spiritual life, but Antichrist will teach you how to expand endlessly in material world, but this world is empty and there is like no spiritual dimension to it. And he also goes on with this like list of examples after that, all of them sort of commenting on different parts of modern society, including new technologies and such. Remember, it was written like against the backdrop of things like airplane and airships emerging, so people indeed fly often, became a common way of transportation, or at least it became a possible way of transportation, and so on. But I really love this passage for a different reason. Because when I was reading it, I was thinking for myself, okay, so what would Grasset say about the present day like commercial space race? About like figures who are telling us, okay, so the future of humanity is like all about colonizing space and so on. It's literally these two things, like flight, which is nothing, like no spiritual dimension to it, and like endless expanse through technology. Of course, he obviously did not live to even see like Gagarin and the first space flight. But it is very interesting that being written 100 years ago, it sort of resonates with some of critiques that nowadays I hear when people talk about, for example, this space race and like the projects of space colonization and such. It's interesting also, and that's the last bit that I will say about Grasset, so that not to bore you anymore, is that Grasset's book is really a testimony to very eclectic community that existed in the diaspora at the time. Even Christian authors were incorporating elements from all sorts of places, from Asian religions, from different esoteric movements existing at the time, and we know for a fact that Grasset was actually interested in those. So it's interesting that, so remember, his main point is that materialism is bad. Materialism is basically the key ideology of Antichrist. So to fight the Antichrist, we need to convince ourselves and others that there is more to the world than just material world. And he goes as far as to suggest that we can prove it experientially and give like an exercise. It's like kind of like appendix to the book where he says, okay, so if you were not convinced by all of my arguments thus far, just do this nice exercise for 12 days and you will see all of these like spiritual worlds yourself. As you can see, the exercise itself is pretty straightforward, a kind of meditation. He says like you need to concentrate on the center of the head at the point just under the nasal bridge, burning with a spiritual desire to perceive the energy surrounding us. We would suddenly see, he says, a radiant light, and in it, the entire world, multitudes of persons, beautiful faces and phenomena. The deeper we direct our hearts towards the light, the more beautiful things we see, the closer we are to the solid, the earthly, the uglier and more repugnant they are, unquote. So it really feels as if he did try it and indeed had some kind of visions. It also resonates strongly with other mystical literature that we discussed, for example, in the first lecture, like The Roles of the Worlds, which also describes similar hierarchies of spiritual beings. But for today, I just leave it for you as a testimony to how diverse and how at times strange was Christian thought in the Russian diaspora. It was really diverse. It incorporated so many things. And for example, Grasset also incorporates the idea of reincarnation, and then he has to negotiate reincarnation with the resurrection of the dead in a very weird way. So he believes that all incarnations will be resurrected but will share the same soul. I'll not go deeper into that. But it's really a very weird world that he proposes. He's not the only one who spoke about reincarnation. Several big names in Russian religious philosophy of the time, such as Nikolai Losky, for example, also argued that Christianity is compatible and indeed requires the idea of reincarnation on different grounds. But yes, again, a testimony to the diversity and weirdness of this emigrant religious philosophy. Now, the second figure. This guy is even less known than Grasset. Grasset is already fairly unknown figure, but this person is even less known. He does not really have much to do with religion, but the reason I wanted to include him specifically, well, there are several reasons. First of all, if you check the birth date of Lev Grasset, notice that it's 1906, and this other guy, Apolinary Nijinsky, was actually his exact contemporary. He was born also in 1906. And the book that we also have there, Человек во фраке, a man in a dress suit, was printed in 1937, so exactly the same year as the second edition of Grasset's book. So they were like very much contemporaries working in very much the same time, but this somewhat different fates in that they has, their starting points were different, but also their ending points were very different. So the story of Nijinsky is this. He grew up in a family of a judge in the town of Blagoveshchensk, which is located in Siberia, very close to the border between Russia and China. And when the revolution happened, he realized that probably the Bolsheviks would not be particularly happy about a former judge who sentenced plenty of Bolsheviks in his days as an imperial official. And so he realized that he needed to immigrate. His family did not want to immigrate, so he actually left alone, apparently, at some point after the revolution. So he ended up, I'm not sure in which exact year, because again, we have very little information about him. But basically, he at some point decided to immigrate and ended up in Harbin. He really started life there from scratch as a young person. He basically tried to build his life for himself, eventually moving to Shanghai, where he became relatively well known in Russian diasporic literary circles. Though he didn't write much, just 2 books, he was also, I think that was his main source of income. He worked as a host for like music performances and such, basically giving like opening introductions and so on and so forth, what we call conferencier in Russian. And he was fairly successful there until the end of the World War II, when he realized that with the start of the civil war in China and eventually the communists becoming the leading force there, he needed to move out of China and decides to move by the time he had become married. And so he and his family basically moves to Brazil, specifically to Rio de Janeiro. And for the rest of his life, again, it was like 12-ish years, they basically lived there in Rio de Janeiro. And the reason why I wanted to use his example is that we have a testimony of his son about how their life in Rio de Janeiro looked like. This is a photograph of Rio de Janeiro in 1955, actually. In the middle of the 1950s, exactly when this family got to Brazil. So here's what his son wrote. Our life in Brazil was extremely tough. Father could not continue his work as a Russophone writer. He couldn't organize a translation of his works into foreign languages. Furthermore, he did not speak Portuguese and could only find job in small Anglophone communities. He met tourists at the port of Rio de Janeiro and offered his services as a guide to Russian or Anglophone tourists. Our family was very poor and oftentimes we did not know if we would have food for the next day, unquote. That was a truth for many of Russian immigrants at the time, although of course individual circumstances differed. It depended very much on whether you already had a network in that country, whether you knew the language, what kind of profession you had. But situations like this were definitely not uncommon. So the life of an immigrant, refugee, is fairly tough. So, yes, this is how after World War II, basically many people started to live from Europe, started to live from China, ended up being dispersed all around the world. Some of them ended up in Latin America, some of them ended up in other parts of the world, like Australia, even Iran. Some of them made it to North America, for example. So by the 1950s, we have this Russian diaspora dispersed through pretty much all, or at least most of the continents. Now, the question is, how and whether this diasporic community was glued together? And the answer is it was glued together through many things, but one of the biggest ones was magazines. Magazines, periodicals. Periodicals became fairly important in the Russian diaspora at the time because through them people were able to create and maintain transnational communities. People sending letters to these periodicals that were published afterwards, sometimes sending essays or articles, and there were periodicals for all sorts of interests, for example, religious periodicals, political periodicals, those with more of a historical focus, and so on and so forth. And they really became these hubs, these nodes for transnational communities, and the way to maintain the connection or the network within the Russian diaspora that transcended national borders. So one example of this that we have in the exhibition here is the magazine called Pre-Thought, Вольная мысль. It was published in the early 1960s and was printed, particularly this issue that we have, was printed in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. But interestingly enough, none of the people of this issue, none of the authors, and not even the editor lived in Argentina, so I'm not sure why exactly they printed it there, but yes, it was printed nonetheless in Buenos Aires. Well, as I have said, it was a big hub for the Russian diaspora, for the Russian immigrant community, so kind of stands to reason. But again, interestingly enough, we have this collective of people from different countries like France, United States, and so on, publishing in a journal printed in Argentina and distributed through most of the world, including the Soviet Union. I will explain in a moment. So another interesting fact about this specific item that we have exhibited there is that it actually has a dedication. It's not particularly legible on the slide, but it basically says to dear Maria Konstantinovna and Nikolai Alexandrovich Salomin, for good memory, from the author of one of the articles of this collection, Dmitry Grigoriev, and then Washington, D.C. here. It's issue of this magazine was gifted by Dmitry Grigoriev, this person, to this family. So who was Dmitry Grigoriev? Let me start with him and then go through very briefly some of the key figures associated with this magazine to give you the idea of, again, like how geographically diverse was these publications. So Dmitry Grigoriev, he was a priest, but though not in 1961, he was ordained actually a bit later. He lived in the United States because the inscription says so. It's Washington, D.C. There in the United States, he studied in St. Vladimir Theological Seminary in New York, and then later taught Russian literature at Georgetown University. He was actually a specialist in Dostoevsky's legacy, and his article here is also about Dostoevsky. But that's what happened to him by the 1960s. If you look at his life more broadly, it's actually a fascinating story of like traveling throughout the entire world. So Grigoriev was actually not born in Russia. He was born in 1919 in London, in a family of Russian immigrants who immigrated to the UK. His father was no more, no less, the governor of Sakhalin, a region of Russia, the like very, very far east part of Russia. So his father was a governor of Sakhalin under the imperial government. Then after the revolution, left for England, and that's where Grigoriev was born. He actually was a UK citizen, not a Russian citizen, so at least that part he had fairly easy. So he grew up there in London, although not really in London, because very soon in the 1920s, his family moved from London to, you guess it, Japan. Didn't guess it. No. But they did. The second time Japan appears in our story tonight. So they moved to Japan, and they lived in Japan until the start of World War II. And as you can imagine, being a UK citizen in Japan was no legal thing at the time, so they had to move back to Europe. And then Grigoriev actually went, a kind of big arch, through Europe all the way to Australia, where he enlisted in Royal Navy and served during World War II in British, not exactly the Navy, he served in what was called the British Merchant Fleet. So it's basically non-combatant ships that were in charge of transporting things to England, from England during World War II. Still a big part of the history of World War II. So that's what he did during the World War II. After World War II, because towards the end of World War II actually, he secured a job at the British Office of War Information, which was this kind of governmental agency in Britain at the time. And he was sent to the office of this British Agency of War Information in New York. That's how he ended up in the United States. And after World War II, he actually ended up there in the United States, then basically settled in New York, went to Yale University, he graduated from Yale. He got his PhD in a different university. He went to St. Vladimir Theological Seminary, which was this big hub for training Orthodox Christian theologians in North America. And the rest of the story is here on the slide. Other figures who published there were no less fascinating. So let's look at exhibit number 2, Victor Baidalakov. It's actually the editor of the journal. He was not a philosopher, a historian, or anything like that, although he did teach Russian at Georgetown University together with Grigoriev in the 1960s. He's like a totally different kind of person. So by the time of the 1917 revolution, Baidalakov was actually an officer in the Russian imperial military. He's a very young officer, just graduated from the military academy, but he did fight in the civil war against the Bolsheviks. Left these retreating anti-Bolshevik forces and ended up in Belgrade, present-day Serbia, where he established, or was one of the people to establish what was called the National Labor Alliance. Despite the fact that Labor Alliance might sound very like socialist, it was actually a nationalist anti-communist organization, designed specifically to fight the Bolshevism. So the way they fought Bolshevism were manifold, and it's like a separate kind of fascinating story. They did all sorts of things. For example, they smuggled anti-Soviet literature in the Soviet Union in many ways, including sending it on the air balloons, hoping that people will get it. Most of the time, as they say, KGB agents actually got all of it and happily stashed it somewhere or burned it or something. They also sent their agents to the Soviet Union, usually foreign students, to also like bring the literature. Usually, like it was a first copy that they were supposed to continue to copy inside the Soviet Union later. They also tried to create sort of like resistance cells in the Soviet Union, and after World War II, they even collaborated with CIA and tried to like organize like real spy like things in the Soviet Union, although to very little success actually. During World War II, Baidalakov in 1941, I believe, he moved from Belgrade to Berlin. They were kind of collaborating with the Nazis, although Baidalakov was also very strict about saying that we are not like on either side. So we are not supporting Hitler, we are not supporting like the Soviet Union. We definitely hope for the fall of the Soviet government, though. And that was like okay in the first years of war, but by 1944. The Gestapo decided that they were not like pro-German enough, so he ended up in a German concentration camp. For like approximately a year before he was freed from there, because General Vlasov, who was a leader of like Russian collaborationists in Nazi Germany, basically helped him to get out of prison. And after the end of World War II, he is actually able to stay in Europe before then later immigrating to the United States. As I have said, this organization even collaborated with CIA later to sort of like organize anti-Soviet actions. In fact, Soviet authorities took them very seriously. Quite a few stories of like Soviet spies trying to assassinate somebody outside of the Soviet Union were about the members of the National Labor Alliance. So there were like several assassination attempts trying to get to the leadership of this alliance and so on. In the mid-1950s, it split into several organizations, and then Baidalakov took part of his followers. They created what was called Russian National Labor Alliance. Which was one of the offshoots of it. But yeah, that's basically his story. Now, the reason I wanted to tell you this, because it really explains a lot about this journal. He wrote sort of a foreword for each of the issues of this periodical, and the general spirit of these forewords is that this periodical is, like the intent of it is to create, to shape the alternative to the Soviet ideology, to show that there could be like a different Russian ideology. not only for people in the diaspora, but also for people in the Soviet Union. As I have said, they actually very intently tried to smuggle this into the Soviet Union. So the idea was to publish texts about Christianity, Russian Orthodox tradition, Russian history, mostly from conservative sort of right-wing perspective. But the idea was, again, to shape the alternative for the communism. That was the general intent. And then again, the people who were published in this journal were all big names in the Russian diaspora, in the history of Russian soil. Such as Nikolai Losky, for example. In fact, this number 3 that we have was actually a big part of it was to celebrate 90 years of Nikolai Losky. It has an article dedicated to his 90-year birthday. It was published in 61, and just in 1960, right before that, Losky celebrated his 90-year jubilee. He was this big, titanic figure in the diaspora community. He started way before the 1917 revolution, and when he ended up in the diaspora at the age of 47 years old, he was already a big name in philosophy, not just in Russia, but really very recognizable outside of Russia as well. Just like all of other figures, he's very fascinating person in terms of his biography, in terms of his personal path. He was born in a family of sort of small level official in the western part of the Russian Empire. When he was in the high school, he was actually kicked out of the high school for being an atheist. This guy's religious philosophy later on. But he was kicked out from high school for being an atheist, and that's what happened in the Imperial Russia. So his family somehow managed to get enough money to send him to study in Europe, thinking that he will not be able to get any education in Russia. So he ended up in Switzerland. Studied there for several years, then had financial problems because apparently his family could not sponsor him. So he enlisted in the French Foreign Legion. So he spent some time in the French Foreign Legion, then returned to the Russian Empire, managed to get to Petersburg University and graduated from there, and basically was already teaching by the time when the revolution happened. After the revolution, his path was like this. He left, initially he stayed in the Soviet Union until he was kicked out of teaching for being Orthodox Christian. Sad story. First time was kicked out from education for being an atheist. Second time for being Christian. All this out of sync, so to say. So he ended up eventually leaving the country. In fact, he was forced to leave the country. And he ended up in Eastern Europe, initially in Prague, then in Bratislava, then he taught in Paris for some time, then his son immigrated to the United States, and Losky joined him in New York for several years, until he basically retired and returned to Paris, where he lived for the rest of his life. Just two other figures. Vasily Zinkovsky, another big name. He was actually the dean, the person in charge of this Saint Sergei Institute in Paris, where many of these figures were associated, like Losky, for example. Zinkovsky was the sort of the leader, the big overarching figure in Paris, in the French Russian diaspora scene. He himself was of Ukrainian descent. He actually grew up on the territory of contemporary Ukraine. He was educated in Kiev. He studied in Kiev University. His father was a high school principal. And Zinkovsky, again, he basically had a pretty straightforward academic career before the 1917 revolution. Then, soon after the revolution, he left. And again, similar trajectory. First Belgrade, then Prague, then for a couple of years the United States, until in 1927 he was able to settle in Paris and again stayed there for pretty much the rest of his life. He's mostly known for writing a kind of monumental text about the history of Russian philosophy. His opus magnum was called The History of Russian Philosophy, was completed in late 1940s and was so influential that, in fact, it is one of the few cases when a Russian immigrant text was officially printed in the Soviet Union, although its distribution was prohibited, or limited, I should say, restricted in the Soviet Union, but nonetheless, again, such an influential text that it even was to some extent allowed in there. And finally, Alexander Schmemann is another big name in Russian Orthodox theology of the 20th century. Like Grigoriev and Zinkovsky, Schmemann was also a priest of the Russian Orthodox Church. He was born in Estonia, where his father immigrated soon after the 1917 revolution. His father was actually a lawyer and a high-ranked politician before the 1917 revolution, and then, of course, he had to leave the country. Eventually, the family moved to Belgrade, then to Paris, and it is in Paris where he studied in that very institute that was led by Zinkovsky. So he belonged to more or less the same intellectual milieu that was shaping in France at the time. Then later on in his life, after World War II, he was invited to work in New York in St. Vladimir Seminary, because what was going on there at the time is that they were trying to sort of reimagine the seminary. They had a new dean of the seminary, and they basically tried to change their program from being primarily Russian, Russophone, to being Anglophone. And part of the reason they wanted Schmemann there is because of his linguistic proficiency and so on, as well as the experience of teaching in St. Sergius Institute in Paris. So basically, Schmemann moved to the United States and later lived through the rest of his life there, working at Radio Liberty, being a host of a radio show, teaching in St. Vladimir Seminary, and as well as several universities like Columbia University, New York University, and so on. So all of this diverse community of people moving between countries, sometimes, yes, like Baidalagov and Grigoriev working at the same university, but more often than not, only for a couple of years being in the same place and then leaving to be spread, to be dispersed all over the world, came together and were joined together through this kind of activity, through submitting to the same journals, through reading and commenting on each other's works. They created the intellectual community of the Russian diaspora. So the history of the Russian diaspora is to a large extent the history of books and the history of publications. They allow you to see who knew whom, who were in conversation with whom, and they were really the glue that held all of these networks together. Again, sometimes in the diaspora there were local nodes, like we saw in Georgetown University, like we saw in Paris, but to connect them together in this truly international, transnational network, the books and the magazines were essential. All of them being in dialogue with each other, creating community that transcended specific political views or specific interpretations of Christianity. Sometimes they were very unusual, sometimes they were very weird. But all of these people tried to imagine imagine what Russia can be. Or even beyond Russia, what these cultural areas, like Slavic cultural areas, what they can be, what can be their future, what can be the alternative project, which is not the communist project. And another important part that we don't necessarily remember is that these people were not just writing for the diaspora. They were also trying to maintain connections with the Soviet Union and include in this dialogue people who stayed inside the Soviet Union. They hoped that what they were doing would be read by people inside the Soviet Union and that it would bring the cultural transformation that will later on become social and political.